Hey, good afternoon. It's Friday afternoon, May 21st. Doing things a little bit earlier because it worked out this way, but again, so cool to be outside and with the lake and being outside, just basking in the beauty of God's creation and this weather that He's brought to us this day. So we're going to continue talking about Joseph, but I want to talk about the way that He brought Joseph to power, because it's consistent with what God has done throughout history. We're talking about three people in particular today: Joseph, Moses, and Daniel. He brought all three of them to power in ways that are not what we would script. There was no carefully laid out political campaign. There was no marketing. There was no polling, no focus groups, no primaries, no polls to figure out who was popular and who wasn't. Rather, God did three very similar actions with showing that He has power with the most powerful countries in the world. So Moses, he's born to a family of slaves. Things have gotten pretty 400 years after Joseph's time. Born to a family of slaves, and the game plan of the Egyptian government and Pharaoh was to kill all the baby boys under 2. So his mom puts him in a boat on the Nile River, and he winds up being taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, raised as a prince, and then thrown out again and despised in Egypt and turned away as a foreigner, and comes back later, after 80 years, comes back as the leader of Israel and takes over his people away from the powerful Pharaoh, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 500 years later, roughly, Daniel is among those captured by the Babylonians, carried off from Judah into Babylonia. And Daniel rises to power simply by doing what God told him to do. Just as Moses came to power the second time by doing what God told him to do. And Daniel honored God, and God honored him and raised him to the second most powerful place in the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Joseph, going back now 1,500 years before Daniel, Joseph comes to power as someone who was a slave sold into Egypt, in prison, but continues to be faithful and serve God, conscious of the Word of God, conscious of the presence of God. And when it's an opportunity to present himself before Pharaoh to interpret a dream, he immediately credits God. This is not the pathway to power and success. This is not how you take over foreign governments, but it's how God takes over foreign governments. And because of Joseph's demeanor, his courage, his trust in God, his trust in the promise of God, Pharaoh sees that this is the man I want to run my country to save us. No experience except that he's faithful with God. And he's confident that God rules. We see the same trait carried out when Jacob comes to Pharaoh, comes to Egypt, meets Pharaoh, and Jacob, leader of 70 people who are starving, comes down to meet Pharaoh. And what does Jacob do when he meets Pharaoh? He blesses him. Normally it's the greater that blesses the weaker. Well, in this case, the greater was Jacob because he represented the hand of God. Do you see the pattern emerging here? God does what He wants. As Isaiah tells us, God's ways are not our ways. So when you're discouraged and you see how everything is going around you and it doesn't look good and you see no way out, God has a way out. And that's what's important. We need to follow Him, whether we are rescued in the moment or not. Joseph waited 13 years, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. He waited 13 years. No expectation of what God would do. But when God came and freed him and brought him in the moment Joseph was ready and gave credit to God and honor God. That's where you and I need to be. That's what we need to teach our children. This is God's world, his country, his universe. He does things on his schedule. He honors those whom he wishes to honor, which is Nebuchadnezzar learned from Daniel. God is able to humble those whom he wants to humble. God's way, God does things differently. Things aren't lost. We just need to trust God, honor him, and see what he has for us. And that's the thought for this night. Again, thanks so much for being here, and Lord willing, we'll catch up in the morning. You have a great night. Bye-bye.